keep looking left rather than looking right. For anyone who hasn't come across me before, my name is Rich. I've been part of the church for a while here. And today we're talking about Living Word, Mark's Gospel. And I've called it Seeing. That's the theme I'm going to draw out. And as I've said before, I think every time I get asked to preach, it's always a privilege and a challenge. You know, it's a privilege because you get to have an excuse to set aside a decent amount of time to look deeply into one topic. So basically all of my Bible reading for the last 2 weeks has been Mark. And the theme in the passage today is quite fitting from that perspective because it's about growing in knowledge and growing in understanding. So I tend to, when I start reading, you start with the text and then you think, oh, I'm not really quite sure what that means, so I might pick up a little commentary like this if people know it. The Tom Wright For Everyone series is superb. It has 6 verses at a time and then 2 or 3 pages of kind of quite light, accessible commentary. If at the end of that I'm still not quite clear where we're going with it, I pull out the big guns, and this is just Matthew and Mark actually, and I've got lots of volumes covering other parts of the Bible as well. But I think there's always a challenge when we come to passages, particularly passages we know well, and if we've read the Bible a bit over our lives, to come at it with fresh perspectives and try and put aside our preconceptions. And I think that is the challenge for some of us. For some of us, it's all fresh and new. We're coming at it for the first time. And the danger of preconceptions, I was reminded of a couple of weeks ago. I went with one of the school classes that our kids are in to Westminster Abbey. And I was slightly apprehensive about taking a bunch of 6 and 7-year-olds around a 1,000-year-old church in central London, but they were great. But we also had these lovely people showing us around, and very often, they're trying to make it very accessible for children, I realise, but they were saying things like, Christians believe ... And most of the time, I would have agreed with them. Sometimes I wouldn't necessarily have agreed with them. I would have thought, that's actually Anglican tradition. That's not necessarily what all Christians believe. So just another kind of emphasis in terms of when we're coming to our texts and when we're coming to the Bible, let's try and do it with fresh perspectives. So I think as Luis mentioned earlier on, we've had a series over 7 weeks of the Jesus-centered story. So we were trying to see how the whole of the Bible is a story about and pointing to Jesus. And I had, I think 16 books from the Old Testament, and that felt like a bit of a challenge to put something together from that perspective. And you might think, well, today's must be pretty easy. How do we see Jesus in Mark's Gospel? It's a book all about Jesus. Surely that's pretty straightforward. But that's the problem. It's a book all about Jesus. So how do I draw out anything which we can kind of grapple hold of and take home with? Because I can't go into every chapter, I can't go into every verse, and there are all kinds of different themes and wonderful things in there. And as you may know, as a church, we've been reading together through Matthew's Gospel. The Mark bit starts quite soon, doesn't it, Robin? Or now shows how up to speed I am with that. So it's now. And so, you can obviously read through and pick up some of these themes as you go, but what I'm trying to do today is introduce a little bit about the Gospels as a whole, then specifically Matthew, and then specifically one particular theme within Mark, of which there are many more. So we're going big, we're going all the Gospels, including Matthew. We're then going slightly smaller into Mark, and then we're going slightly smaller again into actually just the middle bit of Mark. So that's the idea. I wanted to start with this question, right? So there are 3 other perfectly good mini biographies or biographies of Jesus, namely Matthew, Luke, and John. So why do we need one more? In fact, why do we need more than one at all? And this is a genuine question, so think about that. To be fair, I should say before that, if you were going to pick one, the only fair thing to do would be to pick Mark, I would have thought, because it's the first one. It's the oldest one. It was the one that was written first, and Matthew and Luke are thought to have read Mark first and then use that as some source material. So I don't want to belittle Mark in all of this. But genuine question, why do we need more than one gospel? Why have we got 4? Why does our New Testament open up with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, seemingly all telling the same story? They're all stories about the life of Jesus. Perspectives. Yeah, what do you mean by that, Louise? Yep. So different people seeing Jesus, the same person, but seeing him from different perspectives. Sorry? Mark did miss out the nativity, and yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Yep. Does that trouble you, Nathan? Or because he missed out, someone had to write a later story to put it in? Yeah, Christmas is cancelled. Well, that's true. That's true. Because Mark goes straight into John the Baptist and then Jesus appears on the scene there. There is no nativity in Mark. It's absolutely right. But yes, so to Luis's point, it's all about different perspectives and different emphases. You know, you can tell the same story multiple ways. That's why we get films in the cinemas which are, 10 films about the same person or 10 films about the same book. They're not identical. They're not the same. They have a common theme that runs through them, but they give us different angles, different takes on things. They arrange things in particular ways. Sometimes they include stories, sometimes they leave stories out, depending on what theme they're going for. And as a very kind of fairly trite example of this, guys, I don't know if you can bring up this video, which I found on YouTube. It's 47 seconds long, so don't worry, it's not very long. We might need the lights off because it's very, very dark. It's also in black and white. I think it must have been filmed in about 1950 something. It's a bit like a government information video. But do you just want to stick that on, Ying Hao? Don't worry about the text so much.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression.
So you got a man running away from a car from a side street.
Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression.
He now encounters someone on the street. Might look like he's attacking him.
But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
Saves him from bricks falling off a building nearby. So it's quite a neat little story from the perspective of, if you look from one angle, you get one aspect of it. If you look from another angle, you see another aspect of it. You look from a third angle, you start to put all the pieces together and start to see everything that's going on. And perhaps particularly relevant given our topic today of seeing, I don't know if people have ever seen this kind of graphic before. So this is if you had a load of people who weren't able to see. If they were to encounter an elephant, what would they make of it? Because they can only really encounter one bit of it at a time. They might get to the tusks and say, hold on a second, what's going on here? Oh, this feels like a spear. What about those big ears? Oh, well, yeah, no, they feel like fans. Or if you just got the end of the trunk, ooh, that's probably a snake, isn't it? And the big trunk-like legs, well, they might be trees, and the tail could be a rope. But the point being that once you step back and you start putting all of these different pieces together, you start to realize what you're dealing with. And so it is with the Gospels, with their different perspectives, with their different angles. And it's really once you can pull all of those different perspectives and angles together, and I should say they're all true in the sense that they all portray a great angle on Jesus' life, but we don't get the full glory and the full perspective on it, the full spectrum of what is being said until we piece them all together. And I mentioned earlier, I think about films. Sometimes on a film you get a close-up shot, so you just kind of see a little bit of people's faces. Sometimes you get very wide shots, so you see more. In almost every piece of TV these days, you get drone footage, it seems, because that's just the new tech, isn't it? And so you get these broad, wide, sweeping shots, or shots that can follow people as they go through. All the same story, all the same people, all the same characters, just seen in different ways. You might also, or Robin would probably prefer to think of it as a painting that you look at from other angles and other perspectives. I'm not going to go into that because I'll get it wrong in terms of what you see, but Robin can give you those kind of insights, and whether you're going for the details or whether you're stepping back and looking at the whole thing, and whether you can see the hidden depths. So let's just have a quick look at the four Gospels here. And I should say, you will find loads of tables like this online. This isn't definitive. You know, there are all kinds of different ways of seeing the Gospels. But this, I think, is a helpful way of giving us idea of what's happening with the different Gospels and the different emphases in them. So the portrait of Jesus. So what particularly are they each focusing on when they're looking at Jesus? So Matthew looking at the kingship of Jesus. Mark looking at the servant, the suffering servant. Luke, Jesus as teacher. John as Son of God. Not, as I say, that in Matthew he isn't a servant. It's just a question of emphasis. It's a question of focus. Who were they writing to? And this goes to Louise's point, you know, the different perspectives and who's it being addressed to. Matthew probably writing to a Jewish audience. Mark writing to Christians in Rome, the Romans, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And I should say, this isn't just kind of theoretical, historical nicety. I think there's actually some good stuff that comes out of this. Luke writing to the Greeks, and John writing to the church. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the key phrase, and this in Mark is really interesting, this word immediately appears 40 times in Mark. So this idea of action and moving forward and a really kind of rip-roaring story where Jesus is doing loads of interesting stuff, and it's a story which moves from Galilee to Jerusalem. That's the whole kind of story arc, as we'll see. And picking up on the genealogy, this was Nathan's point earlier, it's not there. You know, Jesus' birth and that kind of, you know, the origin story in modern parlance isn't there in Mark, and it's not there in John. It is there in Matthew and Luke, but they do it differently. So when we see these things and we see them doing it differently, it should prompt us to think, what's going on? What are these guys looking to highlight? What is their particular focus? What is their particular approach? So let's just take a quick example so we can see how this comes up. Right, so feeding of the 5,000, story that people are broadly familiar with, miracle of Jesus, 5,000 people, didn't bring any food, problem to solve in terms of feeding them. What do people remember of the feeding of the 5,000? Any key facts about the feeding of the 5,000 that people can think about when you think of that story? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So 5 loaves and 2 fish, they feature in all the stories, all 4 stories. So it's in, if anyone wants to look it up, it's in Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6. But the 5 loaves and 2 fish, they are there. They're in all of them. Okay, how about, where did the 5 loaves and 2 fish come from? Sorry? Small boy, according to John. The boy doesn't appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He does appear in John. What about the administration? Does anyone remember anything about the administration of this miracle? Sorry? The disciples took baskets around? Yeah. But who did they take them to? How did they arrange it? Does anyone remember this? Groups, exactly. Yeah. So they have groups. But if you read John, there's no mention of groups. He's not interested in the groups. He's interested in the boy, but he's not interested in groups for what he's talking about. If you look in Matthew, the groups are there, but there's no mention of how big they are. If you look in Mark, the groups are 50s and 100. If you look in Luke, it's groups of 50. So they've all got their own way, all consistent, all telling the same story, but just emphasizing little things depending on what it is that they're trying to tease out. So if you read Matthew's version of it, he focuses on the compassion of Jesus. If you read Mark, he talks about the compassion for the crowd, but also the compassion for the disciples and getting over their initial doubts. If you look at Luke, he's focusing on the miraculous nature of the event, and he is quite into the order of the event, you know, the groups of 50. He's focusing on that. Look at John, and he focuses on the boy. What's he doing there? So I'd encourage you, when you think about and you read these kind of stories, you do have a bit of a think of the different perspectives and the different angles, and why has he mentioned that? Why hasn't he mentioned other things? What's he trying to tease out? What's he trying to help us with? So I promised you the big picture. That was the Gospels. Now on to the next bit down, which is Mark itself. And I mentioned that Mark is a journey. It's a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, and there's all these immediatelys, and they keep moving forward and forward and forward. Actually, quick question. How do we know Mark wrote it? Why is it called Mark? Sorry? To Mark, yeah? Is it signed Mark at the vet? No, there's no mention of an author in Mark. But we call it the Gospel of Mark. Why do we do that? Well, because the early church did that from quite really early on. So there's a guy called Papias in 140 years after Christ, referring to an earlier source, saying, Mark wrote this, sometimes call him John Mark, same guy, and he was a close mate of Peter's. And what the early church think is that he hung around with Peter, he collected Peter's eyewitness testimony. It wasn't shaped into an orderly account. That's what Mark did. He gathered all these stories together and then very deliberately, not randomly, deliberately set it out in a particular way. And the way that he did it, as we'll see, is that he largely just tells stories of what Jesus did. He doesn't draw too many conclusions for you. He leaves that to you. He doesn't have great theological discourses. He just says what Jesus said and did, and then you can decide what happens from there. But we don't know very much about Mark, and if you're interested, you can look at Acts 12 and 15, because he does seem to appear there. We know his mum was called Mary, kind of familiar theme in the New Testament, but I think it's different guy and different mum. And sometimes called John Mark, as I say, and he accompanied Paul and Barnabas on one of their missionary journeys. And this is quite interesting because it turns out at some point he decides to just go home, which really annoys Paul, to the extent that Paul and Barnabas fall out over this. And as much as it's an unfortunate story, I think it's quite interesting again. Another story of a flawed biblical character who then forms the very basis of our Bible, of our canon. And I should say that there is also redemption for Mark, because Peter later refers to him as my son Mark, which suggests they've become very close. And then Paul, in his letters to the Colossians and to Timothy, he seems to reconcile with Mark as well. So there is a happy ending on that one. And as I said, the way that Mark has done it is that he starts off with a single sentence. Has anyone got it there, actually? Has anyone got it open? Mark 1. If not, I can find it. That is basically, the opening gamut, and from then on, it is just a story. Have you got it, Dan? Thank you. So that's it. Now, that's. Oh, sorry. I should say thank you, Jane. That was. Thank you for finding. It is. That is the kind of the statement which defines everything for Mark at the start of his gospel. So what's he saying there? The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And we kind of take that as read. But the fact that he's named him as Messiah, and the fact that he's named him and identified him as Son of God, that's the key thing. That's Mark saying, this is who I think this guy was. Now here's the story. You make your own mind up. You take from this what you will. And the reason why in part that was important, and we'll see it as we come, and we saw it in the passages that were read to us earlier, is that Jesus didn't look like the person they were expecting. He didn't look like the Messiah they were expecting. They weren't even necessarily expecting the Son of God, but they were expecting a Messiah. He didn't do what they wanted him to do. They wanted him to come in and bring political freedom. They wanted him to, kick out the Romans and all the rest of it. Were they willing to set aside their preconceptions, talking about preconceptions before, and recognize him for who he was, that this was the real deal. This was the real article. So, I mentioned earlier on that Mark was... Oh, who was Mark? We've done that one. Who was he writing to? I mentioned that he was writing to the Romans, or so people think. I mean, much like it doesn't say at the end of it, yours sincerely, Mark, it also doesn't say to the Romans, yours sincerely, Mark. So why do people think it was written to the Romans, and why does it matter, more importantly, or why is it useful and interesting for us to know? The first thing is, there are bits of Mark which wouldn't make sense if he was writing to Jewish people, for example. So if you get the chance, have a look at Mark 7, 3-4. He's got this whole couple of verses on hand washing, Jewish hand washing. In fact, it's put in brackets, so it's obviously like an explanatory note. In case you're not familiar with it, this is why this is important. This is why this is an issue. That would have been completely unnecessary if he was writing to Jewish people. They would have known it. It would have been a bit like writing to people in London and saying, there's an underground system of trains which we call the tube. You know, you wouldn't need to say that to anyone. They know exactly what that is already. But if you're writing to people outside of that context who aren't steeped in those kind of that knowledge and tradition, then that's important information. Equally, some of the words that Mark uses suggests that he's writing to people in Rome. So in Mark 12:42, in English it's often translated, I think, as penny, referring to a coin, a penny. The original word for that Mark used was a quadrans, which is a small coin from the Roman era. So again, he's trying to connect with them and make them aware of something that they know and they understand. It's very unlikely that would have been the word used at the time, because Jesus wouldn't have used that. You know, it would be much more relevant to the people who were receiving it. He also focuses quite a lot on the Romans. So the Roman centurion has this massive role in Mark. He brings it all together at the end of Mark. And interestingly, he focuses quite a lot on suffering and persecution. I mentioned earlier Jesus is portrayed as the suffering servant in Mark. Why is that relevant? Well, because if he was writing to Roman Christians in AD 60, they were having a really tough time of it. Really, really tough time of it. And then finally, Mark has quite a simple, direct style, which again might be suggested that would work quite well with people who weren't that steeped in Christian tradition, or Jewish tradition, I should say. Why is any of that important? Why is any of that relevant for us? Because it's basically a book for us, isn't it? Most of us didn't grow up in a knowledge of Jewish tradition and Jewish background and Jewish thought, or even Christian background and Christian thought and Christian theology. So Mark is writing to people who don't have that background, who don't have that setup. And so it's very accessible. Whatever background we come from or whatever history we have, we can pick up Mark and see something very clear speaking to us. And equally, if we feel like we're in a place of suffering or persecution, when he was writing to his original audience, they were in that position too, and so he's also got something for us today from that perspective as well. So it's not just, you know, historical interest or accident or whatever else. There's something there which I think is really helpful for us. So what about Mark itself? So Mark is like a 3-act play, if you will. So the first bit, as I say, is in Galilee. You've got these questions of who is Jesus, what's his message. You know, as we go through this reading series together as a church, you'll see these things coming out. Jesus bringing in God's kingdom, he's forgiving sins. He gets a fairly mixed reaction, I think it's fair to say. Some follow him, some reject him, some don't know what to think. If you look at the parable of the sower, you see all of that pulled together in one story. And then in Act 2, they're on their way. So they're moving from Galilee to Jerusalem, and this is kind of the seeing bit that we're going to talk about for the last few minutes at the end. And then finally, Act 3 is in Jerusalem itself. So he enters Jerusalem, he's got this big royal entry, the royal authority. He dies, and then the centurion, as I say, the Roman centurion, pulls it all together and says, this guy was the Son of God, wasn't he? It's like, oh, finally the penny is dropped for him, and you get the non-religious, non-Jewish person who suddenly realizes what was going on here all the time. And then when you get to the end of Mark, you realize it's got 2 or possibly 3 alternative endings. Otherwise, it just stops. So it even says it in the NIV Bible. It says, basically, this is in later manuscripts, but it wasn't there at the time. And it seems that some people thought the end of Mark was lost, or alternatively, they just weren't happy with the way that Mark ended it, so they decided just to add a few extra verses at the end. No less interesting or inspired, potentially, but probably not exactly necessarily what Mark was hoping to achieve with it. So, we've had the Gospels, we've had Mark. Let's go down into the final point, which is this idea of seeing. And this isn't changing. There we go. Right. So seeing is really important in the central section of Mark. And that's seeing in a very literal way, being able to see you and me, but also more of a metaphorical way, spiritually seeing things, having insight, having understanding. And you might have seen it in the verses we had read earlier. Jesus was saying, can't you see? Can't you see this? And they couldn't see and they couldn't understand. And then there was the 2 miracles either side. So we've got physical healing of sight, and we had the miracle of the guy who was healed in Bethsaida, and we've got the healing of Bartimaeus at the end. And in between them, there are 2 chapters of further kind of teaching and narrative. You've got spiritual blindness. As I say, Jesus talked about his disciples' inability to see. Also seems that the public at the time couldn't really see who he was. They didn't really understand who he was. And it was only when the centurion spotted it that kind of everything fell into place. And then there's this idea of kind of sight improving, like gradual revelation. You remember that the story we heard this morning about the guy in Bethsaida where Jesus brilliantly spits in the guy's eye? So he comes to Jesus, he's blind, Jesus spits in his eye. Does he get healed straight away completely? No, it's a 2-stage process, isn't it? The first stage of it is Jesus puts some spit in his eyes, and he says it's all a bit foggy. People look like trees. And then Jesus, and then his healing is completed after that. So this idea of people growing in sight, growing in insight, growing in knowledge. And that, to be honest, is always going to be the way for us, isn't it? I mean, we're always going to be on the journey of trying to understand more, always on this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, so to speak, where Jesus is imparting more and more things to us, and we get more and more insight into what's going on. And this is kind of, I guess, a picture of the story arc, the Galilee bit and the Jerusalem bit, the first healing, the second healing, and then the bit on the way in the middle. And just, I suppose, to really pick up on the passage that we read earlier, if we just take it, here we go. Right. I was talking about how there's lots of seeing things in here. And I think Jenny read it brilliantly, incidentally, earlier to pick all this out. The disciples have forgotten their bread. And then Jesus talks about watching for the yeast of the Pharisees, and they say, Jesus is obviously saying we've got no bread. And he's going, what? Are you guys idiots? I'm not talking about that. Do you still not see? Do you have eyes but fail to see? Can't you really understand what's going on here? Maybe flick it onto the next one, Ying Hao, because this doesn't work very well. Sorry, can you flick back? So he's talking to the disciples. He said, you don't see. He heals the guy at Bethsaida and says, do you see anything? His sight was restored. So seeing, sight all the way through. Next slide, please. Then they're talking, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and Peter does see. He says, you are the Messiah. He gets it. He understands. Suddenly he sees. Then in the very next section, Jesus calls him Satan. Suddenly he doesn't seem to see anymore. This kind of gradual revelation, partial sightedness. He gets some of it, but he isn't getting all of it. He doesn't really understand what God's up to. He doesn't really see what God's up to. Can we go to the next slide, Ying Hao, please? Then we get this story about James and John. This is all in the same run, who basically seem to think that the kingdom's there for them. Well, what we're trying to achieve here is power and authority for ourselves. Thanks very much, Jesus. That's what I'm looking for in this whole deal, in this whole structure. So they don't see it either. They don't get it either. And then if we can go on to the next bit. Then they come into Jerusalem. People seem to be starting to see, starting to understand. And then we have the story about blind Bartimaeus, who says to Jesus, I want to see. And then immediately he does receive his sight. So what's going on in this whole kind of story arc, in this section of Mark? Well, as I say, Jesus complains that his disciples can't see. Not physically can't see, but they can't see. They can't understand. They don't know what's going on. He then heals a blind man. Not coincidence. Mark has deliberately put those 2 stories together. And he's kind of paralleling those stories so people understand what's happening. And the parallels are quite stark. So if you look at the Jesus healing the guy at Bethsaida, it says he took him away from the village. And then when he takes the disciples to give them sight, he takes them away from the lake and the crowds. So he's taking people out of their environment. And then at the end of both of them, he insists on secrecy. If you look at it in 26 and 30, to both of them, he said, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. Now, you can discuss why that's the case. We haven't got time to do that today. But again, just showing you the parallels between the story. Of course it fails because the blind man actually goes around and tells everyone. But that happens quite a lot in Mark. And then you've got this two-stage process of illumination that I was talking about before. So this guy who was blind, Jesus spits in his eyes, he sees people like trees, and then he gets complete restoration. So the crowds see Jesus as well, but they don't see him for all he is either. They also have partial sight, like the blind man with the trees. The true extent of who Jesus is hadn't landed with them yet. And the same, actually, for Peter. You know, the true extent of who Jesus was, Peter hadn't got. He got part of it. He recognized that he was the Messiah, and then Jesus in the next verse is calling him Satan, because there's other bits of it that he doesn't get, because Jesus wasn't exactly what people thought. You know, he wasn't everything that they were expecting, because they'd come at it with their own preconceptions, their own preconceived ideas. And Jesus was challenging their thinking and challenging the prevailing world order. And that's fundamentally the message for us today. Are we willing to let Jesus challenge our view of things, challenge our preconceptions, challenge the way that we've historically read Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, and willing to come at it with a fresh lens and a fresh light and say, hold on a second, who is Jesus really here? Is it not just what we've picked up, or not necessarily what we've picked up, but actually someone who challenges our preconceptions at their heart. And we end this whole section with the story of Bartimaeus. So a man who can't see physically, but he actually sees exactly who Jesus is. He calls it out straight away and says, you're the Messiah. There's all these people around who can see perfectly well, but can't see that. And Bartimaeus, who can't see, says, you're the man. You are the man. And Bartimaeus is a man of courage, he's a man of faith, he's a man of discipleship. You know, there's that brilliant bit where he tosses his cloak by the side before he's healed. Jesus says, come here, he tosses his cloak. What's going on with the cloak? You don't need a cloak to stay warm in Jericho. Never gets cold. The cloak isn't there to keep him warm. Why is the cloak there? The cloak's there so he can collect money because he's begging, because there's no social welfare to look after him. And as a massive act of faith, he chucks away the cloak before Jesus has even healed him. He's decided he's going to go after Jesus and walk in his way and be a disciple. And he believes that Jesus can help him. And Jesus says, your faith has saved you. You know, that whole act, and some of that we miss sometimes if we read through these stories too quickly, but even those 4 or 5 words, that whole act shows his commitment to Jesus and his desire to leave behind his old life and join the way, as it was called. And compare again James and John, who were saying, Jesus, what we really want is to sit next to you when you're ruling. And Bartimaeus says, I'm chucking away my old life and I'm running after you. And you know, they're the disciples. They're the people we make stained glass windows of. But Bartimaeus is the guy who is really the guy who gets it, who really understands it. So I'm just going to wrap up. Final slide. Just two points. What kind of a Jesus do we see? Do we see a Jesus who fits our preconceptions? The Jesus that kind of fits with the way we want Jesus to be? Is he the heavenly vending machine that James and John were looking for? The person who'd given what I want, you know, seemingly completely unaware what the kingdom is actually there for. You know, it's for the restoration of the whole world. It's not for individual advancement. And are we willing to be challenged as we continue as a church to read through the Gospels, to see the fully rounded Jesus, you know, the King, the servant, the teacher, the Son of God, and all the other aspects that you see in the Gospels? And are we Bartimaeus, or are we the disciples? Do we have this holistic view of who Jesus is, and are we willing to throw down our cloaks and run after him and say, actually, that's the old life. I don't need that anymore because now I've got Jesus. Are we in it for ourselves, or are we in it to be true disciples? And let's also not be content with half measures. You know that first story, the blind guy spitting in the eyes? It didn't stop halfway. You know, when he could see people like trees, that was a huge improvement from 0 sight since birth. But he didn't stop there. He kept going. Let's keep growing in our knowledge, our seeing, our insight, our understanding of Jesus. Let's keep digging into the Gospels and all the other great aspects of the Bible. Let's dig into commentaries. Let's dig into what other people have to say on these things. Let's learn. Let's prayerfully consider these verses and these chapters as we go through them and get a whole rounded view of just how amazing Jesus is. We put him in quite narrow boxes, and he's up to so much more and was up to so much more than we could ever understand from an easy kind of simple read through. And there's lots to be gained from one read through. There's more to be gained from two reads through. There's even more from three, and even more from digging into what other people think and prayerfully considering it. So I'm going to close in prayer, and then I think we've got a song to finish up. But maybe just before I pray, just spend a minute or two of thinking about these things, of what kind of a Jesus do we see? Have we tended to stick him in a little box which suits us, that fits us, that we've been doing this for a long time, we've been listening to sermons for a long time, and so we've got our own view, and some of that will be great and some of it won't be quite right. Are we willing to keep putting that on the altar and keep thinking about who Jesus is? And are we Bartimaeus or the disciples? Are we all in? Are we the people who recognize Jesus for who he is and don't kind of hold on to semblances of our own life or our own advancement or our own promotion? Or are we all in? Are we chucking the cloak away because we just don't need it anymore, because we're just doing something completely different? Let's just have a minute or two of thinking, reflecting, praying on that, and then I'll